Iran may have made the biggest miscalculation of this entire crisis by believing it could shut the Strait of Hormuz and still keep control of the consequences. What was once supposed to be Tehran's ultimate pressure tool now appears to be turning into the very mechanism Washington is using to break Iran's grip over one of the most important waterways on Earth. After ceasefire talks failed to produce any real breakthrough, the United States moved with startling speed and force, starting at 10 a.m. On April 13th, the message became unmistakable. Not only Iranian ships, but every vessel, regardless of flag, would now face inspection before being allowed to pass through Hormuz. That is not a warning shot. That is not symbolic pressure. That is a full-scale effort to impose a new military order on the world's most critical energy choke point. And the stakes could hardly be higher. More than 50,000 American troops are already on heightened alert across the Middle East, while major outlets such as Reuters and the Wall Street Journal have discussed the possibility that the United States could move toward a force posture of nearly 100,000 personnel if the crisis deepens and if Washington concludes that European support remains inadequate. The buildup has already begun in visible form. C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft are moving huge volumes of personnel and equipment into the region. KC-135 aerial refueling aircraft are turning the skies into a moving logistics grid. Elite infantry units are redeploying to forward positions. And at the center of the operation sits the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, bringing with it stealthy F-35s, multi-role FA-18s, and the kind of naval and air power designed not merely to respond to a crisis, but to dominate one. Washington has not just decided to open Hormuz. It has moved to place its own lock on the strait. In reality, the threshold was crossed 2 days earlier, on April 11th, before President Trump formally announced the blockade operation. That was the day 2 American guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Petersen Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, forced their way through the dangerous waters of Hormuz. Their passage was not simply another naval transit. It was the beginning of a new phase. It was Washington pushing the door open and daring Tehran to decide whether it wanted to slam it shut by force. Iran's response was immediate and furious. Revolutionary Guard naval units tracked the destroyers, and then came the radio warning that shattered any remaining illusion that the situation could still be managed quietly. Final warning, final warning, final warning. Divert to the Indian Ocean immediately. Those words cut through the silence of the Gulf like a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. That warning mattered because it revealed the true scale of the crisis. It was not just a challenge to 2 American warships. It was a challenge to the entire idea that Hormuz could remain a globally accessible waterway without Iran's consent. And once Tehran made that challenge openly, the strategic logic changed. Washington could either pull back and effectively concede that Iran still held decisive leverage over the strait, or it could escalate and seize the initiative. The United States chose the second option. But this crisis is already much larger than Hormuz alone. Cornered and under pressure, Iran has reportedly intensified pressure on civilian shipping beyond the Gulf itself, using its regional network, and in particular the Houthis, to create more instability around Bab el-Mandeb. That means the confrontation is no longer confined to one narrow waterway. It now touches 2 of the most strategically vital maritime arteries in the Middle East. One links the Gulf to the wider world. The other links the Red Sea to global trade routes. In practical terms, Iran appears to be signaling that if it cannot dominate Hormuz on its own terms, it can still set multiple choke points on fire and force the world to deal with disorder on a regional scale. Still, Washington's first focus is Hormuz. And despite the headlines dominated by giant carriers, destroyers, and aircraft, the most dangerous part of the crisis lies in the deeply asymmetric tools Iran has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of showdown. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is not trying to fight the United States the way a conventional navy would. It is trying to turn the strait into a floating trap. That means swarms of small, fast, heavily armed boats. It means hundreds of drones, including Shahed 136 variants and Mohajer-type platforms, able to saturate air defense and create confusion. It means hidden launch points, mobile coastal missile batteries, and perhaps most dangerous of all, a seabed and water column seeded with drifting naval mines whose exact positions may no longer even be known to the side that placed them. This is what makes the Strait of Hormuz so terrifying in military terms. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. That means the distance between billion-dollar American destroyers and cheap Iranian attack craft is not measured by grand operational depth, but by seconds of warning and meters of maneuver. In those waters, asymmetry becomes a weapon in its purest form. Iran does not need to defeat the United States conventionally. It only needs to create enough danger, enough uncertainty, and enough political cost that the effort to force open the strait becomes painful, expensive, and potentially unsustainable. That is exactly what Tehran's swarm doctrine is designed to do. Bogh Hamar, Zulfiqar, and Ashura-class speedboats, armed with heavy machine guns and rocket launchers, can close distances fast and force the U.S. Navy to expend costly defensive munitions on cheap threats. Hundreds of one-way attack drones can appear from multiple vectors and stretch the engagement capacity of major warships. And below the surface, mines become the silent force multiplier that no radar can solve by itself. Moored contact mines, magnetic mines, and drifting charges laid irregularly by small craft create a hidden battlefield beneath the visible one. Some have likely shifted with the currents. Some may now lie far from where they were originally deployed. This means every mine-clearing operation is also a gamble, and every ship movement through the corridor carries risk. That risk is why the blockade operation is not as simple as drawing a line on a map and declaring American control. Trump's order may have established the political framework, but maintaining it under fire is another matter entirely. The United States can inspect ships, escort convoys, and deploy overwhelming force. But the problem is not whether Washington can bring power to the region. It already has. The problem is whether that power can neutralize a dispersed, irregular, underwater and shore-based threat network without suffering a politically explosive loss in the process. Because even one serious hit on a U.S. warship, one successful drone strike, or one mine detonation under a major vessel could change the entire trajectory of the crisis. And yet, Washington appears determined to accept that risk rather than retreat. The reason is not hard to understand. If the United States backs down in Hormuz after Iran openly challenges freedom of transit, then the consequences will travel far beyond the Gulf. Washington knows that a retreat here would echo in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, and even in Eastern Europe, where rival powers would study the outcome and draw their own conclusions. If America allows a regional power to blackmail the global system through a strategic choke point, then every other revisionist actor will see the precedent. This is why Hormuz is not just about oil. It is about credibility. Iran seems to understand that as well, which is why it keeps escalating the war of nerves. Along its mountainous and cave-riddled coastline, The regime has long built a network of mobile anti-ship missile launchers, concealed drone launch points, and hidden logistical nodes that are difficult to identify even with advanced satellite surveillance. Missiles such as the Noor, Qadr, and Khalij Fars give Tehran the theoretical ability to threaten any ship entering the narrowest sections of the strait. These are not abstract capabilities. They are the core of Iran's anti-access strategy. The entire point is to hold large vessels at risk in an environment where room to maneuver is minimal and reaction times are brutally short. Still, the United States is not entering this fight blind. If anything, the emerging American doctrine suggests that Washington's answer to Iran's asymmetric threat is to strike preemptively and massively at the infrastructure that makes the threat possible. That is where the A-10 Warthogs come in. Their presence in this theater is not accidental. These aircraft were built to punish exposed targets brutally and at close range. Their 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannons can shred small, lightly protected attack boats in seconds. And in a shallow, cluttered maritime battle space where swarming speedboats may be one of Iran's most immediate threats, that matters immensely. With the number of A-10s reportedly rising to around 30 after recent deployments to regional American bases, these aircraft are now positioned to act as low-altitude predators over the strait, hunting any Iranian naval element that ventures too far into the open. But hunting fast boats is only part of the picture. The larger and more dangerous problem is the missile infrastructure hidden deeper inland. Those launchers, those bunkers, those command centers, those radar sites, and those drone depots represent the real strategic threat to any sustained American blockade. That is why the next phase of the operation may depend not only on maritime patrols and inspections, but on a huge air campaign designed to destroy those assets before they can be used. Strategic bombers, such as the B-52 Stratofortress and B-1 Lancer, already linked to deployments from RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom, are the kind of platforms that could deliver exactly that kind of punishment. Loaded with bunker-busting munitions and smart bombs, they would be able to target underground launch complexes, buried storage sites, and hardened command positions with devastating effect. The logic is brutally simple. Instead of waiting to intercept the missile in flight, destroy the launcher. Instead of chasing the drone after takeoff, destroy the underground cell before it can launch. Instead of allowing Iranian commanders to dictate the engagement timeline from concealed coastal positions, erase their command and control architecture altogether. In that sense, the U.S. response is built on a classic strategic principle. Do not catch the arrow in the air if you can kill the archer on the ground. That logic also undercuts Iran's most powerful form of blackmail. For years, Tehran has been able to imply that if pushed too far, it could set Hormuz ablaze and unleash a regional energy catastrophe. But that threat only works if Iran believes it can fire first and survive the consequences. In reality, the first large-scale anti-ship missile salvo Iran launches may also be the moment it invites a devastating wave of retaliatory air power onto its own coastline. And in a sky increasingly dominated by American stealth fighters, electronic warfare, and aerial surveillance, that is an extraordinary gamble. Still, no one should underestimate the residual danger. Even if American air superiority is overwhelming, even if the U.S. can systematically strip away launchers and radars, it only takes one low-flying cruise missile, one well-hidden kamikaze drone, or one drifting mine to turn a billion-dollar vessel into a burning symbol of miscalculation. That is why the underwater dimension of this fight is just as important as the air one. Knifefish autonomous underwater vehicles and other unmanned systems are now central to the battle. They are not glamorous. They do not dominate headlines like carriers and bombers. But if the strait is ever to be reopened in a meaningful way, it will be because these quiet machines mapped, identified, and helped neutralize the hidden mine network below the surface. And if that hidden thread is not cleared quickly, the crisis could become even more dangerous through time alone. The longer the strait stays under military lockdown, the more global shipping patterns are disrupted, the more pressure builds on markets, and the more alternative political and economic responses begin to emerge. In fact, that shift may already be underway. The moment the U.S. blockade was announced, it became obvious that tankers were starting to rethink their routes. Very large crude carriers, carrying millions of barrels, began diverting toward the Gulf of Oman, rather than risking movement through an active military choke point. Trump's own public remarks pointed to what this might mean. He suggested that ships were turning around and heading for the United States, effectively implying that American ports, especially along Texas and Louisiana, could become fallback destinations in a market suddenly desperate for safe crude supply. That matters because while Washington's steel wall across Hormuz hurts Iran directly, it also reshapes the global energy map. Tehran's economy, already fragile, depends heavily on oil exports that move through the very waterway it has now helped destabilize. Before the war, Iran exported somewhere around 2 to 3 million barrels per day. If those flows are suddenly blocked, throttled, or placed under American inspection and control, then the regime is not just under pressure. It is suffocating. The sole lifeline keeping its war economy breathing would be directly squeezed. But the most strategically significant pressure may fall not on Iran first, but on China. That is where this crisis takes on its largest global dimension. China, the world's factory, depends heavily on imported crude oil, and a substantial share of that energy comes from or through the Persian Gulf. A particularly sensitive portion comes from Iran itself. Beijing has spent years building methods to keep this energy flowing despite American sanctions, including arrangements conducted in yuan rather than dollars. That is not just a trade workaround. It is part of China's broader effort to weaken the dominance of the American financial system and build alternative channels of exchange outside Washington's control. That makes the Hormuz blockade far more than an anti-Iran operation. It may also be a strike at one of the key arteries feeding China's industrial system, and one of the channels through which Beijing has tried to normalize de-dollarized energy trade. There is a reason this matters so much. Nearly half of China's immense oil import requirements are tied to flows that must pass through Hormuz. If the United States now controls that passage, inspects every ship, and threatens to stop vessels linked to sanction-evading energy movements, then Beijing may find itself forced back into more expensive and more tightly monitored supply chains. In that scenario, oil that once moved cheaply and discreetly from Iran could be replaced by supply purchased through American allies, through the dollar system, and through shipping routes more vulnerable to U.S. pressure. That is why Trump's statement about stopping ships that pay tribute to Iran may have had a second audience beyond Tehran. It may have been directed just as much at Beijing. The blockade does not merely challenge Iran's sovereignty claims over the strait. It threatens the architecture of Chinese access to discounted, sanction-resistant energy. If Beijing loses that access, then one of the quiet pillars of its economic resilience comes under strain. And this is where the crisis enters truly dangerous territory. Because what happens if China refuses to accept that outcome? What if Beijing decides that allowing the United States to militarily dictate the movement of Chinese-flagged or China-bound tankers through Hormuz is unacceptable? What if, in an attempt to test American resolve, China dispatches a large tanker directly into the line of the blockade. At that moment, the world could face one of the most consequential naval confrontations in modern history. The question would be simple and terrifying. Would the United States really stop and inspect a Chinese-flagged merchant ship on the high seas in the middle of an active military crisis? If Washington does, Beijing could frame it as a direct assault on Chinese sovereignty and commerce. If Washington does not, then the blockade begins to look selective, porous, and strategically incomplete. Either outcome would carry major consequences. A weak response could embolden not only China, but also Gulf states, regional powers, and rival actors who might conclude that American resolve still has limits. A hard response could take a regional crisis and turn it into a direct confrontation between the United States and China. That is why Hormuz is no longer just a Middle Eastern crisis. It is a global stress test. It touches energy, trade, maritime law, alliance credibility, financial architecture, deterrence, and the question of who truly shapes the rules of international commerce under pressure. It is also being watched intensely in Moscow and Beijing, not simply as spectators, but as strategists. Russia, already benefiting from higher oil prices and global energy instability, has every reason to welcome prolonged disruption. China, meanwhile, is calculating both the economic pain and the strategic implications. And both are likely measuring how much American force can be committed and sustained in the Gulf without weakening U.S. posture elsewhere. That wider implication may be the most dangerous of all. If the United States becomes deeply tied down in a drawn-out Hormuz standoff, then every other flashpoint begins to feel the secondary effects. The Pacific matters. Taiwan matters. Eastern Europe matters. Russian and Chinese planners know this. They are observing the buildup, the logistical tempo, the coalition response, the European hesitation, and the political language from Washington. Hormuz is therefore not just a battlefield. It is also a live test of American capacity under simultaneous global strain. And that brings us back to the central irony of the crisis. Iran believed closing Hormuz, or threatening to do so, would hand it the ultimate bargaining chip. Instead, it may have given Washington the pretext to seize operational control of the strait, strangle Iranian exports, pressure China's energy access, and reinforce a broader doctrine of military coercion at a strategic choke point. The very lever Tehran thought would save it may now be the mechanism through which its room to maneuver disappears. But none of this means the outcome is settled. Far from it. The blockade may be in place, but holding it is another matter. Iran still has asymmetric tools. It still has mines, drones, missiles, and speedboats. It still has the ability to create crisis, even if it cannot win a conventional confrontation. And Beijing still has choices. It can adapt, it can wait, or it can test Washington directly. If it does, the consequences may not stop at shipping lanes and oil prices. They could reshape power balances across the globe for decades. That is what makes this moment so extraordinary. When American destroyers point their guns down a strait that carries the lifeblood of the world economy, and when the next vessel over the horizon could belong not just to Iran but to China, the line between regional confrontation and global crisis becomes vanishingly thin. Hormuz has become more than a passageway. It has become the place where military doctrine, economic survival, great power rivalry, and strategic credibility are all colliding at once. And the world now waits to see whether the United States can truly hold this blockade, whether Iran can keep raising the cost without triggering its own destruction, and whether China is prepared to challenge a wall of American steel in the narrowest and most explosive energy corridor on Earth.